from the perspective of the mid-19th century that they didn't want to call fugitives refugees because they never were a people with a country in the first place. Whereas you could understand white Unionists as refugees because they were displaced Americans. So that's why I think that ultimately sort of they came to that decision of separating refugees from freedmen. But that doesn't address the kind of complexity of how you talk about it now, and I'm actually delighted to hear historians not unreflexively continuing to use the term contraband.
Can I just say really quickly, I didn't use refugee for a long time because of that white-black distinction until I found so many of them blacks called refugees during the war itself. So I forgot about that. That's the reason why I didn't use it at first. Freedmen you can't use until later. I don't know.
Same row. We need to move a little swiftly. Lunch is waiting, but we're fine. Okay, I got two up front, I got two in the wings. Okay.
I also would like to thank the panel for the presentations were excellent. My name is Oliver Patterson. I actually retired from two schools, City College of New York and New York University. And since retiring, I've been involved in a church ecumenical project called Covenanting for Educational Justice. The broader term is Covenanting for Justice and Environmental Justice. And the focus that you placed on policies and practices that maintain inequality is something that I've found over the last 4 years, and probably many in this audience known for centuries, that when you look at education, the fact that New York City graduates only 27% of black male students is not accidental. It's a result of policies and practices that have been embedded in the system for years, as well as others, not the sole thing. But I think we really have to look at the research that you produced and say, how is it that today, in today's world, we still have the type of inequality that you presented today? And we have to look specifically at real practices and policies that are in place that often we don't even see and recognize.
Thank you. Kate, you want to comment?
I agree, and I think it's I think that sort of paucity, the thinness, the attenuation of the possibility of making claims to equality in the world that we live in right now is tragic. I mean, and I guess I'm a historian, so I have to kind of talk about the past, but what I wanted to do was talk about the ways that this stuff about the broadening of the, first of all, that in this country that claims to believe in equality, there was always a realm of legitimate inequality, which was the social, and the ways that if the bigger you make the realm of the social, and I think then the more inequality you can have that seems legitimate. And so if you think about deregulation, I don't want to get on it, but if you think about all the privatization, all of the kind of things that could be public into private, and the ways that that legitimizes inequality, not only racial inequality, but all different kinds of inequality, that's what I wanted to kind of open up in a way that, historians don't feel always very nervous about doing, but yeah, I agree.
The present is allowed here.
Okay.
All right, we're doing a mini conference, and I'm not doing current human trafficking on the highest later. I got Jim, I got the Downses, and then I got Richard and Rich. Jim.
Well, first, for Chandra, just for Chandra, to further the metaphor, my hat's off to you, because I really am excited that you're doing the work on the contraband, because when I first started my own research 10 years ago, there wasn't anything except Louis Curtis's book, and so, which is excellent, but so on one level I'm thrilled about the work that you're doing. I guess I just have a couple of different questions, and David asked a question about the contraband camp, and I'm thinking more about the social geography of the contraband camps, in large part the extent to which the picture you paint is a moment of interaction between formerly enslaved people and the Army. And from my research, there's all that kind of individual interaction often doesn't take place. That, if anything, if we want to talk about language, or they refer to as contraband, freedmen, there's a lot of slangs that I won't say, and they're referred to as masses. So the engagement for me is not of the individual kind that you're describing, at least in my reading of the records, but just more about what's going to happen to these masses of people in northern Mississippi or in Alexandria or in these different places. And then my own work, which I promise I'll get out, so of course you can't answer this, but the whole thing about sickness is that it's not just there, right? It's there because of neglect of the Army. It's there because the Army's not meeting with officials. And as a result, they don't have rations. And as a result, they don't have this kind of engagement. And that's what produces this type of sickness and illness and this high mortality. Because you paint this beautiful, I mean, just really evocative and just stunning idea of Pine Bluff and just the mortality there. And so my question is, how is that getting there? That mortality is because of a lack of interaction. But now just to help you, because I think that your argument about citizenship, to push that in another way, I think that Stephanie McCurry's saying the same thing in Confederate Reckoning. I mean, it's about the white women pressing claims about soldiers' rights onto, and so she's not looking at a genealogy of citizenship and suffrage, but she's pushing it into this other different way that I think could give your argument some real interesting traction.
I'm not talking about suffrage either, and that's
That's what she's not. The whole thing about the bread riots, she's not either. That's what makes her work so great, is that she has an alternate genealogy of women's activism. It's not punctuated towards something about rights. Instead, it's about how these women are pressing claims upon the state as soldiers' wives. It's the same. The analogy is really similar there. And so her analysis of the bread riots, I'm hearing pieces of, and I think that would allow you to get rid of, worry about this big polemical question of citizenship and set that up as the antecedent.
I think that that's probably true. When I read her book, what my reaction to her book is that the dynamic here is very similar, that the pressures of war are making a central state pay attention to people it has never had to pay attention to people before. And that's what I think is going on in the camps. Why is there all the suffering in the camps? Well, because they're sick and starving when they get there, and the Army has no idea what to do with them. Saints are not marching on here by any stretch, but the Army, but neither is there a settled policy or a settled design to cause mortality, to sickness. There's nothing settled at all. It's that the Army finds itself saddled with a problem it does not know how to solve, and that it subordinates to winning the war. Now, the Army is less troubled than it should be by the sort of ghastly mortality rates, but they're not. That's the Army's just not the Red Cross. They're just not, and they don't act like it. And I don't mean to suggest that they do. But I think I do see a little bit more interaction than you do, and I see the interaction not making everybody join hands and sing Small World After All, but question things they've never questioned before. And I see the interaction in a couple of places. It's in the official records, but I'm also cheating a little bit and drawing on a lot of stuff that I saw with my first book, which was individual soldiers' letters. And in those letters, I do see a lot of very quotidian interaction, buying eggs. Now that doesn't sound like a big deal, but if you have seen nothing but hardtack for 3 months, and you buy eggs from somebody, that is a big deal. And so you start to have a conversation with them, and it turns out that they've been useful to you, and they're not as different from you as you thought. And that doesn't turn you into a civil rights crusader, but it calls into question some boundaries that have never been called into question before. So the citizenship, if that I'm not sure what to do about that term, if that's the problem, because really it's inclusion within a community that can make claims on a state, and I don't know what to call that other than citizenship. Just stick with that.
Okay, we're gonna take 3 more, so they have to get even better, because you're standing in front of one. Great.
I have 2 quick questions. First to Kate, I think it's really interesting, and it's really sort of smart to see you wrestling with these categories of equality. And I wonder about whether the realm of the social is also more contested and fluid at the same time. You're building in a good deal of fluidity. But to what degree do we see a sort of Jacksonian sense of defining the social not as a way of defending hierarchy, but as a way of preventing the government from moving in and creating even more rigid hierarchies, right? And so that the risk of broadly defining a state intervention in social equality is it can create, you know, this world that we all would like, but it also can do all these other things that, you know, that can create even more rigid hierarchies. And to what degree is that fluidity at play? You know, do you see that fluidity at play, and do you see people picking up on that after the war? And then very quickly for Brandy, I think it's a terrific paper, and I would be interested in seeing you push even a little farther and to say, when we incorporate this story into our sense of politics, how does it change our sense of what politics is in the 70s and 80s? What is possible? What's it mean? What's the relationship of its sort of fluidity and this sort of irony that the thing that makes them visible to you is their access and their intelligence in using that access, and yet also their disappointment, right? That it's their appeals against being denied that make them so visible. And how does that help us think about the most broad sense of what politics means in the 1870s, 80s South?
So I was kind of wrestling with this, thinking about, well, what's the utopian vision in my paper? Because, you know, do I think that there shouldn't be a realm that's off limits to the government? No, of course not. You know, so is there some merit to the idea that there are areas where people have sort of relative liberty, taking into consideration that very often those areas are the realms of patriarchy and domestic violence? But let me just, that was, you know, I guess that was uncalled for. But this is another area where the rhetoric doesn't match the reality, because obviously in the domestic realm of poor people was never off limits to the state. Right, and so do you take the Freedmen's Bureaus or the Pension Bureau? You know, like if you're going to make a claim, you have to submit to telling them who you're sleeping with, or they're going to be investigating who you're sleeping with. So the notion that the private or the social sphere is a realm of liberty is a bourgeois notion, right? And the whole thing I'm talking about is a bourgeois notion. And so, but that doesn't mean it's not powerful. And so I think, you know, yeah, certain people would really, you know, sort of say, look, I already have too much state intervention in my life. I want you to respect my social realm more. But that's kind of not the people that I'm talking about. And the people I'm talking about are using a kind of defense of the social as an area of liberty to, you know, in a general sense, to defend inequality, and then in the specific sense that I'm talking about, to defend opposition to racial equality. So, you know, I definitely see what you're saying in it, but I think just there's an important kind of construct and important rhetoric here that I want to bring to light, while still recognizing that, you know, this is not, doesn't reflect the reality of a lot of people, that people are positioned very differently in relation to these ideas of privacy and liberty and that sort of thing.
And let me say, the question you asked is a good one. I thank you for it. It's something that I'm continuing to think through. But I think that if I was to say one of the surprises after sitting with these records for so long is that this is precisely where I think the most interesting claims are coming out of women who are actually denied, right? For me, what I realize is that I really have to think about the state differently and how these women are envisioning this intervention into their lives very differently. Precisely because one of the last points I made in the paper is because it's the very women who are investigated under the law of 1882 that continue to petition the government, to continue to subject themselves to this, because I think the stakes were so high, because the economic need and desperation was so high, but also because they believed in their husbands, their service, and the symbolism of that importance. So I would just say now that I'm continuing to think about that, but I appreciate it.
Richard Hudson came over to the UK, a great friend of the GLC of Glasgow.
I'm too afraid of Dana to disrupt our lunch.
Oh, no,
No, it's okay. It's okay.